Franklin left the police station before the first light of dawn, as the city was beginning to stir. The streets were still quiet, but he knew every corner, every alley, every little store on his beat. After 17 years of service, his instincts had become a second skin. He wasn't just patrolling a city, he was a part of it. But today, something felt wrong. His gut told him that something was about to change. The radio crackled to life with a robbery report. Franklin's heart rate picked up slightly, but his hands remained steady on the wheel. He had responded to countless calls like this, but this one felt different. As he pulled up to the scene, the shop owner was visibly shaken, his face pale with panic. "Someone tampered with the cash register, and then they ran off," he stammered. Franklin took a deep breath, pushing back any sense of unease. He could handle this. He always had. His eyes scanned the area. A figure in a gray hoodie moved swiftly through the crowded streets, his head low, trying to blend in with the morning hustle. The suspect was making a break for it. Franklin's instincts kicked in. He was good at reading people. He had to be. The suspect was running, but not fast enough to escape. Franklin knew how to handle this. He knew how to stay calm, stay in control. "Police! Stop right there! Show me your hands!" Franklin called out, his voice firm but measured. But the man didn't stop. He broke into a run, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. Franklin had no choice but to pursue him, moving faster than he had in years. He wasn't going to let this one slip away. In a flash, Franklin closed the distance, his years of experience guiding his every move. He grabbed the suspect by the arm and took him down. Everything was by the book. Franklin had done everything right. He always did. But that's when everything shifted. People were watching. Smartphones appeared out of nowhere. Bystanders began recording, their voices rising with confusion and anger. "Is this black cop stopping an innocent person again?" One woman's voice could be heard, filled with judgment. It was a familiar echo. Franklin had seen this before, but this time it was different. The outrage grew faster than he could process, and within minutes, the footage had gone viral. The headlines hit hard and fast. "The new face of racism. Black cop accused of discrimination." Franklin felt his stomach twist as the lies spread. He had always known that perceptions were fragile, but seeing the distortion of his actions unfold in real time was gut-wrenching. He had followed the rules. He had done his job. But none of that mattered now. He was being torn apart online. When he got back to the station, the weight of the situation hit him hard. His colleagues tried to offer their support, but Franklin could see the tension in their eyes. The department was under fire. The investigation was swift, and Franklin was suspended while the matter was reviewed. Suspended? It felt like the world was crumbling beneath him. It wasn't just his career on the line, it was his family too, his wife, his children. People started sending threats, leaving hateful messages. The man who had walked through his own neighborhood every day without fear now was a target. His life had become the subject of scorn and hate. At night, when the weight of the world pressed down on him, Franklin would sit in silence, looking out at the city he had always sworn to protect. His community, his family, they were all still there for him, but it was hard to see through the storm. How could a place that had always been home turn its back on him so easily? The voice of his conscience echoed in his mind. "Stay strong. Don't let this break you." But as days turned into weeks, Franklin's world continued to unravel. He felt like a stranger in his own life, cut off from the very people he had spent his career protecting. Each news story, each tweet, each comment made him feel smaller, more isolated. His soul ached for the simple peace he once knew. But Franklin wasn't going to bow down. He couldn't. Not when the people who truly knew him, his community, were there for him. Mrs. Harris, an elderly neighbor, appeared on the local news with tears in her eyes. "Franklin has protected us for years," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Through everything, he's been there. He would never do anything wrong." The community rallied behind him. A petition went up, signatures flooding in from all corners of the city. People who had known Franklin for years, who had seen the work he put in, started speaking out. They didn't care about the lies. They cared about the truth. The investigation finally uncovered the truth. The footage, once twisted beyond recognition, was reviewed. It was clear. Franklin had followed the proper procedure. The suspect had resisted arrest, and Franklin had done what was necessary to prevent him from fleeing. The department reinstated him, but the damage had been done. Franklin's soul had been scarred. The trust he had worked so hard to build was shattered, not by his actions, but by a world that didn't bother to listen before making judgments. But Franklin wasn't just going to let it go. When he returned to the force, something had changed in him. He wasn't just going to be another cop. He had a bigger mission now. The community that had stood by him, that believed in him, needed more than just his service. They needed action. They needed someone to show them that change could happen. So Franklin took a stand. He organized town hall meetings, launched awareness campaigns, and became a voice in the fight against racism, prejudice, and the misrepresentation of his people. One night, at a community event, Franklin stood before a crowd, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I grew up in this neighborhood. I've worked here for years, protecting you. But in my darkest moments, you were the ones who held me up. You reminded me that no matter how loud the world gets, truth has a way of rising to the surface. Together, we fight the real enemy, the prejudice that tries to tear us apart. And together, we will win." The crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't just applause for Franklin, it was for the whole community, for the truth that had finally emerged. Franklin wasn't just a police officer anymore. He had become a symbol of unity, strength, and unwavering justice. Years later, the neighborhood where Franklin had walked every day was a different place. The people who grew up hearing his story now carried his lessons with them. Some became police officers, others became community leaders, but they all carried the same torch Franklin had lit: justice, honesty, courage. Franklin's journey had become more than just a personal victory. It had become a movement, one that spread far beyond the city he'd served. His legacy was a testament to the power of resilience and the unbreakable bond of a community that refused to be divided. Franklin had become more than just an officer. He had become a beacon of hope. His fight for justice, though full of challenges and painful moments, had changed lives. It had planted seeds of understanding and trust in places where mistrust had once been the norm. And as Franklin stood before his people one last time, he knew his work was far from finished. His mission was clear. The fight for justice was not a battle to be won in a day. It was a fight that would last a lifetime. And Franklin was ready to lead it, for as long as it took. As the years passed, Franklin began to see real change in his city. Young people were inspired by his message, seeking justice and fairness in their own ways. The streets that once felt divided were now filled with conversations about unity, about understanding each other, about fighting prejudice not with violence, but with empathy and compassion. The community had transformed, and Franklin was at the heart of it all. He continued to mentor the next generation of officers, teaching them not just how to enforce the law, but how to be leaders in the fight for justice. He shared his story openly, letting them know that the struggle wasn't just about one man, it was about a collective effort to change the systems that perpetuated inequality. Even in his retirement, Franklin's influence lingered. His name became synonymous with justice, and his lessons lived on in the hearts of the people who had been touched by his journey. The city he had once patrolled now carried the legacy of the man who had stood up when it seemed impossible to do so. And though Franklin's journey had been long and full of challenges, he knew that the fight for justice, for equality, for truth would never truly end. It would continue through the lives he had touched, and in the work of those who carried his torch forward. As the final chapter of his career unfolded, Franklin realized something profound. His story had not just shaped the city, it had inspired a nationwide movement. Communities all over the country began to take his example to heart, pushing for police reforms, demanding accountability, and fostering unity. The light Franklin had ignited had grown into a blazing fire. one that would continue to burn brightly, lighting the path for future generations. And as he sat on his porch, looking out at the city that had shaped him, Franklin knew that the true measure of his legacy wasn't in the accolades or the headlines, but in the hearts of those who carried his message forward. The real change wasn't in the system, it was in the people. And together, they would keep fighting for a world where justice, equality, and understanding prevailed.